Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the CIH podcast. My name is Matthew Scott, and I'm a Policy Manager for Net Zero and Sustainability, working in CIH's Policy and External Affairs team. Today, we've got a special edition of the podcast to mark Flood Action Week, and I'm joined by two fantastic guests, both from ZED PODS. We're joined by Debansu Das, who is Business Development Director at ZED PODS, and also Dr. Rehan and Debansu, who is Operations and Technical Director. And I'm going to allow Rehan and Debansu to tell you a little bit more about ZED PODS in their own words shortly. So the first few questions I'm going to direct at you, Rehan, if that's okay. I wondered firstly, could you just tell me a little bit more about ZED PODS, how you got started, when you were founded, and a little bit about the work that you do?
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm Dr. Rehan and Debansu. I've been at ZED PODS since we set the company back up in 2016. I came from a sustainable energy systems engineering background and a sustainability background, looking at how we could deliver more zero carbon homes into the mainstream economy, but also more within the social housing sector. And we were doing a lot of at the time, single dwelling, larger dwelling and not much social housing. So we looked at different ways of doing it, different ways of bringing the quality up, and we settled on setting up an offsite volumetric housing company in order to manage everything from right at the beginning, initial design and engineering, architecture and planning services, all the way through to delivering turnkey houses at the end. And we really found we could drive the level of quality and performance of environmental and social-led homes through doing offsite measures.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rehan. And we'll have an opportunity in a moment to talk a little bit more about your overall philosophy and how you approach these things. But before we do that, considering that we're recording this podcast for Flood Action Week, I just wanted to start by giving our listeners a little bit of background information really about Flood Action Week and sort of why it's important that we mark it. So I wondered whether you could tell our listeners a little bit more about particularly how climate change is affecting the risk of flooding and why that means it's increasingly important that we need to consider flood risk when we are designing and building new homes.
Brilliant. Yeah, so when we develop new homes in the face of changing climate and changing environment, we look at some of the major hazards that climate change brings. And flooding is one of those 5 major climate change hazards, along with changing weather and potential for overheating, storms, droughts, wildfires. But because the water systems are changing, we're getting more water in certain parts of the year and less in others, that the risk of flooding, especially surface water flooding, has increased. And that's an increase in risk currently, but also potential to increase even further. And as climate change exacerbates, the flood risk will exacerbate as well. And when you look at some of the key figures, there's you look at property vulnerability. There's around 5.4 million homes already exist at risk of flooding, and that's set to double within the next 50 years, which if you think about it, could lead to almost 1 in 4 homes in England being at risk of flooding of some sort. Flood damage is very, very expensive. So the economic impact of flood damage of existing buildings at the moment is approximately around 1.3 billion annually. And that's going to rise, especially if we fail to adapt our properties or develop flood resilient properties in line with that. And I think back in when we were we were mainly focused on developing brownfield sites, but part of almost hand in glove, functional floodplains and flood zones came into play with that. And the REBA call that happened in around 2021 that looked into different ways of developing in flood zone was very influential in some of the schemes that we brought forwards, and the process I think we'll talk about a little bit later on how we can bring flood zone houses for flood zones into play for mainstream housing.
Fascinating. Thank you, Rehan. I think some of those statistics are quite stark, aren't they? I know I've looked previously at some of the Environment Agency work on sort of projecting flood risk into the future, and coastal flooding as well as surface water flooding and other types, it's all set to increase over the next 20 to 30 years. And you've talked a little bit there, Rehan, about some of the damage and some of the property, some of the costs of the property damage and how much of an impact that causes. Could you also say a little bit about some of the risks to health and well-being? So for residents living inside homes that are on floodplains or that might be a risk of flooding, when we look back at flood events, maybe, what kind of impacts do we see for health and well-being for people who are involved in flood events?
So there's a lot of different impacts, I suppose, that sort of relate to that, and many impacts sort of health and well-being as well. Um, People living at risk of flooding obviously have an economic exposure to flooding, and some houses, especially if they're social housing that are in areas where there could be risk of flooding, might be worried about the cost of reparations, about the cost of insurance and things like that within those areas, about how they're going to deal with a flood event. And we really need to look at how we build flood resilience into those schemes. I think one of the reasons we've been successful in what we do is by addressing some of those existing housing and properties, and by addressing those and showing that when we bring a new scheme in, we can improve the drainage systems and actually help increase the flood resilience of those existing properties. It really helps with community engagement and well-being.
Thank you. And you've touched a little bit there on sort of some of the things that you do and kind of how you build property flood resilience into schemes. Can I ask you now a little bit more about your sort of overarching philosophy, if you like, at ZED PODS? So I know, as you said, you've worked in collaboration with different social housing providers. You're bringing more flood resilient homes into the market. But before we go into the kind of detail of how you do that, what's your broader sort of design philosophy, if you like, to bringing forward new homes? What are the
Yeah,
first principles that you work with?
so we come from both an environmentally and a socially led background. I think that's quite key. And what we essentially want to do is we want that the housing that's going to be built or is being built in the UK to be more sustainable. We want net zero carbon homes, which we do. We generally, every property we do is 100 rated or 100 plus rated in terms of SAP. We want all those net zero in operation homes to be more socially inclusive. So we don't think they should just be for private rental or private occupier. We think they should be for social rented tenants as well. We want the energy system to essentially be more sustainable and resilient so that energy prices don't fluctuate. But essentially, what we want to do is bring more sustainable homes, protect the greenfield sites by looking at how we can develop brownfield sites and existing sites, bring those into fruition for housing, market failure sites, garage sites, car parks, things like that, and really see what impact we can have on helping the government deliver its 1.5 million homes over the course of this parliament, and looking at all different sort of land types, land tenures, land opportunities to be able to do that. Some of the figures we've come across in the past show that there's around 1 million potential homes that can be built in brownfield sites, and around 90% of those are in urban areas, which are ideal for social housing. People need to live where they need to work to reduce their commuting costs and wider costs like that. And looking at those sort of brownfield developments led us to looking at even more difficult sites. All the sites we do seem to be difficult in some reason, whether it's a tight access, whether it's overlooking issues, things that we have to really take on board in the design and access statements and how we design those schemes. But that led us to look at some schemes that have been through sort of sequential testing and that were available, that were actually in flood zones. And how do we bring those as resilient homes, improve the lives of existing homes around them, and bring in these homes that are in previously undevelopable land into development use for housing?
Yeah, so practically, how do you do that? What are the things that you need to take into consideration when you're looking at designing a flood resilient development? For example, do you think about the geography of where the development is, the particular flood risk category that it's in, and how do you loop in things like, maybe the budget that you're working with or the partners that you're working with? I presume every development has to be approached slightly differently in terms of how you do all of that.
Yeah, I think you've hit on some very key points there. Developing flood zones, I think the best way to look at it's a process. So it's a risk-based approach. It's not easy. It includes looking at things very, very differently. And how you look at the risk-based approach and how you look at the way homes are going to be built and the planning is crucial to getting sites through planning being built. So it's a journey. It's a journey you have to bring the Environment Agency along on, the local planning authority on, and the client, whether that's a local authority or a housing association. You have to bring them all along the way on that journey. So, I mean, really, there's two strict tools that sort of almost restrict or prevent developing in flood zones. So it's the sequential testing and the NPPF, so National Planning Policy Framework. And what we've got to do is be able to show that we can create what we can do to pass the exemption test to show that these schemes are deliverable. So social housing, a local client might have used or built on all their main prime sites, and the only sites they've got left to deliver their social housing commitment might fall into those zones that are within flood zones or more difficult to build on sites. So we've got an in-house capacity, an in-house set of designers to be able to do feasibility and manage that process right from the beginning. So we start that journey with our clients very, very early on. And we've got access to the right specialists to be able to help comment and help us go through that. And one of the key things is to show that we're building the most sustainable buildings possible, because we need to show that sustainability is going to outweigh the flood risk, and that the mitigation elements that we put in place is going to outweigh the risk of flood to the properties and show that we're building flood resilient properties. So detail, education, collaboration, and bringing people along on that journey is key. We've also got to show that we're not going to increase flood risk elsewhere within the riparian system. And we decided very early on that we're not just going to show we're not going to increase flood risk, we're going to show we're going to actively improve the flood risk of local areas and buildings in that facility. So it really starts in looking at those sites, mapping those sites, categorizing the probability of flooding and different types of risk of flooding on those sites, and then showing how we're going to overcome those and really develop resilient sites. So we raise our buildings 2.4 meters off the ground, which means that even in the areas that are most prone to floods, you're never going to get flooding that comes up that high to affect the front door of the properties that we're building. We then do, especially at planning, really on the outset of design, conduct really detailed flood risk assessments and detailed drainage designs. That includes showing what we call the SUD systems, or the sustainable urban drainage systems, developing those in detail right at the beginning and going above and beyond what the minimum requirement is. And you've really, to develop flood zones, you've got to have that at your core, to go above and beyond what those minimum requirements are in terms of performance of the building, resilience of the building, safety of means of ingress and egress, and also in means of developing those SUD systems to look at not just what you're abating on site, but abating in the surrounding area as well. And then working with communities and doing that community engagement so that local people understand that what you're doing is going to improve their risk at flooding and resilience to flooding, rather than exacerbate it by bringing in different forms of housing. So, you know, things like porous paving, suds attenuation tanks, rainwater gardens and landscaping, different forms of slowing the water down, hydrobates, things like that. All of that has to be really considered very, very early on. And then also things that are slightly more technical about. So imagine the scheme that we did at Ashford has a lift to get to all the floors. So that lift, in the event of a flood, needs to have a pit beneath it so that the flooding won't go into the lift. If it did, that lift would actually, instead of going to the ground floor, would go to the first floor, and that the pumps would kick in to pump any drainage that was required out of those. Also to show that all the electrical and site electrical equipment is out of the flood risk zone as well. So it's raised above the ground, and that we have drainage systems underneath and ways to pump that out. So it's really, really far reaching. And that's why I said it's sort of not for the faint hearted, because you've got to consider all of these different elements, and very, very early on in the program, because you've got to bring the Environment Agency and the statutory consultants along with you, as well as the client and as well as the local planning authority.
It does sound like a lot. It sounds like an awful lot just to be able to get permission to build the home in the first place. Which I take my hat off to your designers who must be doing all of that. One of the things that you've mentioned there that I'm quite interested in is the rainwater harvesting and reuse. This is something that we've started to look at a little bit at CIH. There's a recently released consultation about Part G of the building regulations that we've been looking at as well. Could you say a little bit more about your approach to rainwater harvesting and some of the clever, no doubt clever ways that I'm sure that you build that in to some of the development work that you do?
So a lot of that is to do with restricting the flow and keeping the water where we want it to be as long as possible in those sites. We've actually got a couple of schemes that we're pushing through planning at the moment that are actually in areas of depleting water tables. And that's really where it comes more into play in terms of how do we capture that grey water, how do we reuse it for planting, for washing down bin stores and things like that on stores. We've tried to sort of, in what we're doing, because it's social housing, because we want it to be as easy to maintain and operate as possible, we haven't sort of been doing the grey black water recycling in terms of flushing toilets and things like that. We've kept it far more for site use, like landscaping, rainwater gardens, developing swales, developing hydrobakes and things like that, and just slowing the release, keeping that water on site, using it where we can, and slowing the release of water back into the system, into the drainage system.
Thank you, Rehan. And I actually want to bring Debansu in now because I want to ask a little bit more about some of the projects and some of the case studies that you've worked on and that we've mentioned already. So Debansu, as I understand it, you've had a couple of different examples that we want to talk about. We've had a partnership with Mid Devon District Council in Tiverton, and then we've also got your work with Ashford Borough Council as well. Could you just tell me a little bit more about how both of those projects got started, and particularly about some of the work that you had to do in the local communities and with stakeholders to get them off the ground?
Hi, I'm Debansu Das. I'm the Business Development Director of ZED PODS. So thank you. We all know, Matthew, that we're now in a mode of build, baby, build in that status, and finding urban land parcels where this kind of homes that we're offering as a unique solutions is coming very handy. However, land identifications, especially or even understanding a unique solution requires lots of winning hearts and minds at the very outset of the project definitions. So both of the project states, we had to input lots of awareness and educations, not only to the main key client stakeholders, but the cabinet members, high authorities. We placed demo units to have the local community members to understand the implications. So lots of winning hearts and minds in terms of engagement activities needs to happen to ensure that the concept of elevated podium solution can be installed. So we started on the journey on a step-by-step basis. So for example, we did up to the pre-app to understand what kind of implications. We had to use lots of surveys and consultants to understand the implications. For example, Rehan mentioned about sequential testing. I mean, Ashford has nutrient neutrality issues as well. So lots of surveys, intrusive surveys. So this is a long process and the journey of going through the design phase, which requires a step-by-step evaluations and understand and mitigation the risk so that we ensure that what we are proposing tick box every concerned and build that resilience on a floodplain activities. So in a nutshell, client engagements at a very early stage, early collaborations with the proposed design and educating the clients and the stakeholders about the proposed solution is absolutely key to ensure that the clients have undertaken the journey. So that was like over probably a couple of years to undertake the journey. For both instances, Ashford was a little longer because the kind of problems was intense. But once we went through the journey of the early the planning approvals and the environmental approvals, getting the stakeholders approvals, of course, there was another sort of issue of getting the funding approvals because the government bodies who give the funding approvals are also not very sure about the project kick in. So we have to bring in another set of stakeholder engagements and ensure that the project will happen in that, or give that surety to ensure that the clients can unlock funds. And yes, they can unlock more higher rate of grants of funds that also helped in terms of securing the project as well. So overall, it is quite a long process, but I must say that we had to consistently give them the confidence and ensure that they are consistent and get that kind of confidence to push things forward to the next steps. So, so that's how we all started with both the projects, more or less.
Great. Again, sounds like an awful lot of work before you can even start on the actual construction. 2 to 3 years you're talking about. And did you have to do anything as well around specific tests or processes to understand the flood risk of the particular sites you were going to be working with? I understand they'll have been in sort of flood risk zones, but did you have to do anything additional to understand, what is the specific risk of this site, not just now, but in different sort of years to come in the future?
Yeah, so you've got to look at the sort of advanced hydrological risk and make sure that we're covering over that, and we really understand what the flood risk is on that site, and that the mitigation effects of doing that. Raising the building 2.4 meters plus above the ground really helps right from the outset. But then looking at how we do those as a sort of, especially on the Ashford scheme, how you incorporate a lift in that scheme is very important as well. How we look at using the site levels to the best of its ability. So you need to show that we've got stay put and await rescue strategies in there, but also means of egress and escape from the site. So we had a raised escape route over the highest part of the land that would of the site, so that people have a safe way to exit the site as well if the site was to flood. And then looking at what we do below the ground as well. So when we start, especially on both the sites, we looked at the drainage requirements, and we put those suds and attenuation tanks in as soon as we possibly could. So the first thing we do on site is get those groundways, get that attenuation. One, because it helps you build the scheme, because you've got less surface water on site and the site's not going to flood while you're there, because you've got your flood resilience mitigation strategies in place right at the very beginning. Two, it helps show almost a very early impact to the surrounding area and the rest of the local tenants and residents in that area as well. Then when we sort of build those buildings above, by doing things modularly as well, we're bringing those a dry construction where these buildings are between 80 and 90% complete off site. Bring them in, set the crane up, raise them in, drop them onto the podium. So not building above the podium, we're bringing ready-built modules already into the scheme. That helps as well. So it's lots of these sort of different forms of strategies for building a scheme that you have to use all of those levers available to be able to do it, especially when you design the site services as well, and looking at not just the current risk, but looking at the future risk of flooding. So you're not designing for what is currently there, you're designing for future risk of flooding impacts as well. So impacts potentially from climate change, all of those have to be built in as well. So it's you bring all those things together, and you look at what we're doing in terms of showing that sustainability is at the core, which helps us with the exemption side of it, showing that we're offsetting more energy than we're producing, that we've gone with all of the we've maximized all the benefits and tools that are beginning to develop those sites, putting them in the right order and the right sequence, and that we have a strategy, a construction environmental management plan that's going to enable us to do the build, manage to build throughout, as well as the post-occupancy side, how we're going to monitor that and make sure the people living in these homes are living to a high quality of life and standard.
Matthew, I want to emphasize the fact what Rehan said in terms of this, the strategy in action. The early SUDS attenuation work really impact the residents around or the people around. So for Ashford, there is this industrial area where it used to be flooded, the road, and the access used to be restricted. With our work first, that has gone. So that has really brought in at a very, very early stage of a development, the confidence from the people around that these things work, which of course get accelerated with our fast construction activities. For example, in Ashford, all the modules were in place and the scheme were finished in start on site to completion in around 13 months, probably twice that of the traditional construction duration. So that's really accelerate another buy-in of the people surrounding around, the least disruption, the least because of environmental reasons or of construction reasons, etc. So this is very critical to showcase this flood actions or flood mitigation strategies early in the construction phase, which really buy in the stakeholders around the site.
Yeah, see, so this is about demonstrating to stakeholders that you're partnering with, but also with the local community in the area that you're working in, that this is going to be a positive development and that you're doing everything that you can to minimize any potential negative impacts that comes from that. I think, which is brilliant, because it's a principle that we need to see across all development work, not just development work involving SUDS and other things that we're discussing. Both of you, this has been brilliant, and I've learned an awful lot just in the 30 minutes that we've been talking. I just want to wrap on a couple of sort of final questions for you. And Debansu, I might direct this one towards you. Just kind of going forwards, what's the next sort of 2 or 3 years looking like for ZED PODS? Have you got any other developments in the pipeline that you can share with us, particularly any related to flooding?
Yes, we these two developments have really opened up the idea of social housing, sustainable development on flood zones. So because of our elevated podium applications, design structure, and combined with others, this we have brought in so many visitors from professional background, housing background, local authorities, surrounding local authorities, housing association, etc., to showcase. And they are now started to see flood zone as a potential development site rather than discarding them at the first place. So that's a mind shift which has really started to happen in terms of the public sector land availability thought process. So that's a good positive approach. Of course, it's a long way to make sure that people can understand and appreciate that some kind of market failure sites like Ashford or in Mid Devon can be developed positively. So yes, we are getting quite a lot of inquiries as well as in terms of the first base questions of whether these are all developable or not. So I think that these two developments has really hit the point and opened the mind of the clients that this kind of developments are possible, especially for social housing and sustainable developments.
So we're working with around 20 plus local authorities. We've got a pipeline of over 1,000 units going through the factory. We're planning well in advance into 2027 and taking, looking at how we make the factory more efficient and create more units to take more schemes on. So that's really interesting that we're really sort of bucking the trend, especially in modular and offsite, to deliver these homes and stay and keep that factory going and fed with new schemes that we're doing. We're also doing, and it might be more appropriate for another conversation, but we're working in areas where we've got depleting water tables. So almost the opposite of building flood resilient, but building drought resilient and maximizing all those water storage techniques as well. So we're doing both sides of those development. And I think it shows that there are a lot of schemes that are difficult to build. There are a lot of sites out there. And if you approach them the right way, we can turn brownfield sites and make these brownfield sites really, really work, especially for social housing sites that may not actually have any land value for the local authority. But once you get housing on there, the land value goes up, having properties on there, the housing supply goes up, and you really create these windfall sites and windfall schemes. And everyone's got a role to play in meeting these 1.5 million homes. And if we can play our role by doing smaller sites and infill sites, it's great. And we want to help people along the journey.
Yeah, fabulous. I think what really struck me as part of those comments, particularly yours, Debansu, around there has been this tendency in the past to view flood zones as basically no-go areas for development, hasn't there? And you can totally see why, because they're complex and some of the risks coming down the tracks in terms of climate change and flooding risk increasing. It's very easy to see why we might just think, no, we're not going to go there. But some of the things that you're talking about, the philosophy, the approaches, some of the ways that you build, that mindset shift that you've talked about, Debansu, I think is really important, because maybe just shows that if we're taking the right steps, we're working in the right way, we can do this.
Absolutely.
Which is an interesting thought to end on. So we've reached time, really, and Rehan, I want to offer you the last word, so to speak, and just want to ask you if there's one thing that you want our listeners to take away from this podcast about how they can make their developments more flood resilient, or what they need to be doing when they're thinking about flooding. What would that one thing be?
So early engagement with people, with specialists and people like us that know what we're doing and how to get them through from the very beginning, and that we're always willing to give those advice and make sure that sites that might have been discounted can be brought back into the thought process for delivering these types of homes and delivering social homes. And that don't give up on these schemes. There's schemes, there are brownfield sites, there are difficult to build on sites, and there are people out there like us that will be able to engage with you to be able to make these a reality.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rehan, and thank you so much, Debansu, as well, for your time today. It's been a really fantastic conversation, and I think that overall message of we can do flood resilient sites on flood zones, and we probably need to as well if we're going to meet the targets that we all care about. So a really important message there to end on. So nothing left for me to say other than to say thank you again, Debansu and Rehan, for your time. Thank you to our listeners who've tuned in. If you're listening to this during Flood Action Week, we have other things going on in the week. Please keep an eye on CIH's LinkedIn and Blue Sky accounts for news of those. Or if you're listening to this after Flood Action Week, you can look back to catch up on everything that we've produced. So thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of the day, whatever you're doing. Take care.